Good afternoon, and welcome to the Port of Los Angeles October Media Briefing. I'm Philip Sanfield, the Port's Communications Director. Joining me, as always, is Executive Director Gene Seroka. Greetings, Gene.
Hello, Philip, and thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your interest and participation in these briefings. Today, we're privileged to be joined by Matt Shay, President and CEO of the National Retail Federation, the world's largest retail trade association. In just a few moments, Matt will share his perspective on the upcoming holiday season and the NRF's latest data on what to expect in 2024 and beyond. Of course, we both look forward to answering your questions today as well.
Gene, before we talk with our guests, let's start with the Port's latest cargo data. How did we fare in September?
Philip, considering that global trade overall has eased this year, September was a good month here in Los Angeles. The port moved 748,000 container units, which is 5% higher than last year. Now, we've had 2 consecutive months of year-on-year growth. On the import side, we handled 392,000 TEUs. That's a welcome 14% increase over last September, the biggest year-on-year increase we've had in more than 2 years. Much credit goes to the American consumer, who has shown remarkable resiliency in the face of higher interest rates and elevated prices. Retail sales rose 0.7% last month, more than double some expectations. And the surprising growth of the U.S. jobs market continues. It added 336,000 positions last month, and it's a key source of strength for household spending and the broader economy. Meanwhile, we've seen positive trending on the export side of our business here in L.A. With 120,000 loaded outbound containers, September was a 55% jump compared to this time last year. That makes for 4 straight months of year-on-year growth and 5 consecutive months eclipsing 100,000 export units. There are a few factors moving the export needle. First, the most recent data available shows our top export categories with significant gains. Recyclables and animal feed were up more than 30%, and vehicle parts going back to Asia automakers have increased by an amazing 84%. Second, with imports from Asia slowing, there's less demand for empty containers there, which is reflected in the 235,000 empty TEUs handled in September. That's a 19% year-on-year decline. Fewer empties make it easier and less expensive for the U.S. exporters to get their cargo on vessels across the Pacific. In fact, our ratio of loaded imports to exports in September was a very strong 3.2 to 1. Please keep in mind that in September of year 2021, that ratio peaked at 6.2 imports for every 1 U.S. export. We've cut that number in half. This is good news for the U.S. economy because export jobs, on average, pay more than work in other segments. Narrowing the trade gap boosts our gross domestic product, so it'll be interesting to track the third quarter GDP estimate when it's reported this Thursday. So all in, given the muted peak season we're experiencing, our rising September performance is welcome news.
Thank you, Gene. Where do we stand year to date, and how do you see us finishing off 2023?
Philip, with 3 quarters in the books, the Port of Los Angeles has processed about 6.4 million container units. That's 19% below last year and a 12% decline from our 5-year average at this juncture. I've outlined the factors weighing on global trade several times in this forum, and they begin with imports to the United States from Asia, which are down in totality 18% this year. We're tracking very similar with that number. Next, warehouse inventories remain elevated, even as we head into the holiday season. We'll discuss this with our guest Matt Shay in just a moment. And finally, we knew that post-pandemic, consumers would likely go back to spending more of their income on services and experiences and less on in-store products and online purchases. For example, We're seeing that shift now in the furniture category. During COVID-19, a lot of us were working from home and bought a new desk, couch, or dining room table. Large, bulky items that take up a lot of containers. At the surge's peak in 2021, the Port of Los Angeles processed a record 770,000 container units of furniture alone. This year, furniture shipments are tracking to finish at about 560,000 units, and that would be a 27% decline from that high watermark just 2 years ago. Looking ahead, October looks flat versus last year, while our data indicates we'll see a volume uptick in both November and December. So I'm confident that Q4 will be better than last year. I expect we'll finish 2023 in the 8.6 million TEU range. That would be a decline of about 13% year on year, which is an unbelievably good comeback from where we stood in quarter one. You may remember back then, we were down 32%. In the meantime, we'll continue our efforts to return and build market share through Los Angeles. We're reminding cargo owners and shippers every day that Los Angeles is the fastest and most efficient route for Asia trade. All our vital statistics that I monitor, including cargo velocity, dwell times, and vessel arrivals, are in good shape today, and we have room to grow. And with the long-term labor contract in place, the table is now set to scale up as demand increases.
Thanks for that overview. Now it's time to introduce our guest. Gene, would you please do the honors?
It's my pleasure, Philip. The National Retail Federation's members support 1 in 4 U.S. jobs, 52 million working Americans, and they generate $3.9 trillion in annual gross domestic product. Since his arrival at the NRF in 2010, Matt has transformed the organization into Washington's most powerful voice supporting the retail industry. During his tenure, membership and revenue have more than doubled, and the organization's influence has grown significantly here at home in the U.S. and around the globe. Matt, great to have you here with us.
Hi, Gene. Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you as
Thanks.
always.
Let's jump into the questions right away, Matt. What are your member CEOs and the American consumers telling you about trends for the all-important holiday season?
Well, it's the biggest time of the year for sure, as you noted, and I think you alluded to some of the trends and some of the things we're paying close attention to in your remarks just a minute ago. I think the story of the economy, certainly since the onset of the pandemic, has been the resilience of consumers and how consumption has powered the economy, and the kind of work, the challenges, the opportunities that the demand created for you and your team and all of us and the folks that we represent and partner with, because it was truly unprecedented. And so some of those demand factors are, of course, still showing themselves present every day in the way consumers behave. You alluded to the GDP numbers. Retail sales continue to find a way to ooch up. So consumers are very resilient and they continue to spend. Having said that, we know that the way in which they're spending and the way in which they're paying close attention to how far every dollar goes is changing and evolving. And we saw a dramatic shift 18 months ago when inflation really started to hit on the goods side. We saw a shift over to lots of spending back on the services and the experience side, travel, hospitality, lodging, dining, all those things. We haven't seen a complete transition back to sort of the pre-pandemic balance between goods and services. So they're still spending on goods, but we have seen moderation. Their consumers aren't spending as much, and they're not spending it in the same ways. That's really what we're paying very close attention to as we get into the season. Our forecast, we just announced last week, households will spend on average $875 per household on holiday spending this year. That's across a range of different holidays celebrated at the end of the calendar year. Almost 3/4 of that will be on goods. $620 of that $875 will be on goods. The other $255 more on consumables, on decor, decorations, food, other things to support the holidays. So they're still spending, and that number's higher than it was a year ago. So there's still growth there. But I guess what we would come away from this saying is that consumers are resilient. They're still powering the economy. They're catching their breath. They're behaving in a more deliberate way, and we're seeing spending moderate.
Great overview and capsulization, Matt. Bringing it a little closer to the shipping industry with all of that and the trending that you've just shared. You have a great partner in Hackett Associates that, in addition to many others, combine some really good data for the industry to look at. What's the forecast for imports in the coming months and then heading into 2024?
Well, you certainly lived the last couple of years even closer to the action than we did. So you know how the seasonality has played out and how we've seen those big swings and peaks and valleys and things. I think what we believe, based on the data that we've got through our port tracker information and through Hackett and Associates, is we probably hit expected peak already for this year. And we're going to probably see gradual slowing as we get into the rest of the year. So I think volumes will still be strong, but maybe not quite as high as we would have predicted 6 or 8 weeks ago. One of the behavioral changes on the retail side is that we know that consumers are shopping earlier than ever for the holidays. They continue to pull their shopping back into the spring, into the fall, into the summer. So we're seeing lots of people begin earlier than ever. And so retailers have responded by bringing cargo in earlier, stocking up. And I think there's still a little, certainly some memory about what happened when we really had stockouts and shortages. So the combination of consumers changing their behavior and retailers not wanting to repeat a season maybe in which they didn't have all the goods they needed in place when they needed them has pulled a lot of that forward. And so I think we've seen most of that cargo come in already, and we'll see it tapering. And again, we know also that consumers are changing the mix. They're sort of spending a bit less, moderating on the goods side, and so that's having implications for how much cargo comes in and when it comes in as well.
Continuing on that note, Matt, we talk a lot in this forum about the warehouse inventory levels across the nation, especially for retail goods. And the Federal Reserve has been reporting that our inventory sales ratio remains fairly elevated. How big of a deal is that when we talk about the overall mix of cargo, but more importantly, what your CEOs want to do to flush out some of that old product and get the new or trending items into the country?
Yeah, Gene, that really was the story. I'd say in spring of 22, we really started to see a lot of discussion in the industry and the trade, in the business press, about inventory levels. And some of that was the hangover from late 21, when we didn't get goods in that we needed, and then suddenly goods got here, and you sort of missed the market opportunity because there was a mismatch on the timing side when we had the demand versus when we got the goods. And so there were some retailers that spoke fairly publicly about their position relative to their inventory ratios in the first and second quarter of 22. I think that's largely played itself out now. That's not something that we're hearing from our members. I was with a group of CEOs of major retail companies just in the last week for some conversations. This was not one of the things we talked about. It wasn't high on anyone's list. Our assessment is that inventory to sales ratios are really back to pre-pandemic levels, about 1 to 1.3. So we're very close to where we would have been before the pandemic, as opposed to slightly elevated, maybe 1 to 1.5 or 1.6. That'd be a dollar effectively to $1.30 in inventory, or $1.50 or $1.60. We're back down to that pre-pandemic level. So I think people are pretty comfortable about that. They've got the inventory mix right, and they're competing on price at the moment. Because of the inflationary pressures, because of high interest rates, because of debt service ratios, the pressure that consumers are feeling in general. The onset of student loans, you got auto payments, mortgages are, at a 25, 30-year high. So new mortgage origination loans. So I think those combinations have sort of squeezed a lot of the excess inventory out of the system. And so retailers are also moderating and adjusting, and they're in a good place on inventory. In terms of what's needed for the holiday season, back to the comment about Port Tracker, it's our sense that most of the inventory necessary for the holiday season is already here in the U.S., in domestic markets, in warehouses or other points of distribution. And we'll see that continue to come in, but on a more moderate level as we get into the holiday season.
Great insight, Matt. And it must be noted that the Federal Reserve's data does lag quite a bit. So what our group is hearing today is real insight from retail CEOs and what they're faced with right now. Last question from my side, Matt. You're extremely dialed in on policy issues. From the retailer perspective, what are the big items on your agenda now that you're looking to accomplish?
Well, Gene, I wouldn't make light of a really challenging situation, but we need a Speaker of the House for starters to get anything done. And so, all of us that have policy issues, the American people, but every organization in the country that's got a perspective on a particular policy remedy for a challenge or a solution or an opportunity, all of that just comes to a complete stop because one branch of the government really can't function at all. And that's obviously compounded dramatically when we've got the tragedy that's going on in Israel and the Gaza Strip and the loss of life there. And we really need to support Israel and provide aid to those in need. So then in Ukraine. So we got a lot of priorities. The retail industry's priorities are really focused on a couple things. The big one, and you've been part of some of our conversations on this, and I've shared our perspectives before. The big one for us right at the moment is that challenge of organized retail crime and the impact that shrink and theft and loss has really begun to have in a much more substantial way than we've ever seen before. We conducted a study earlier this year, just released recently some of those results, more than $112 billion in losses in 2022 due to organized retail crime, theft, shrink. So it's a huge, huge number. And I think the numbers have always been big. In 2021, it was almost $100 billion. It was $90 billion. But I think what people are finally starting to recognize, appreciate, understand now is how organized retail crime impacts communities, how it hurts the workers, the team members, the associates in those businesses, how it impacts communities and customers that rely on those businesses. If the merchandise, the stock's not in place, or if the stores need to close, retailers are doing everything they can in security measures and protecting the inventory, taking care of their customers, their associates. But in some cases, we're losing stores. And there have been a number of high-profile announcements. It's happening, Gene, on a regional basis. There are some regions and cities hit harder than others. But finding a solution to these challenges is really very high on our agenda. So working with Congress, passed some legislation. One of those bills is the Combating Organized Retail Crime Act. Really provide resources for Homeland Security, the FBI, other federal law enforcement agencies to coordinate with federal, state, local law enforcement to share information, to pursue criminal gangs and enterprises. Very sophisticated operations, not surprisingly. Criminals take advantage of the same technology that legitimate businesses do. They make investments. They're operating in very complex environments, and they need to be challenged with really complex solutions. So spending a lot of time on that issue. And then other issues related to protecting consumers, ensuring we've got a competitive environment for credit cards and credit card competition to make sure, on interchange and swipe fees, we're doing the right things to make sure merchants and their customers can benefit from the savings of technology that banks and financial institutions can pass on. So there are lots of issues that we'd like to see addressed, and we're still hopeful we'll get some leadership on the House of Representatives and get some action on some of this legislation before the end of the year.
Great perspective into your side of the business and how truly complex it is to try to oversee 1 in 4 jobs across the country that so many of our families depend on every single day. Philip, back over to you for some questions from the media. Thank you, Matt.
Very good, Gene. Thank you. We've received several questions in advance. If you'd like to submit one now for either Matthew or Gene, please use the Q&A box below and remember to include your name and affiliation. First question is from Lisa Bartline at Reuters for Matt. Based on what you're seeing with U.S. imports, does the NRF believe that the ocean shipping side of holiday prep is already baked in, or do you expect to see more holiday goods coming in through November?
Well, Philip, I would say I think we believe that a lot of that merchandise, we think it's baked in. We think it's here already, that the peak shipping season was probably this summer and specifically the month of August. Most of that merchandise is here. And I think, to go back to Gene's original question about trends, there are a few reasons that we've seen the calendar evolve and change and inventory being pulled forward and in sooner in the calendar year than was historically the case. A lot of that is because consumers are shopping differently. We see various retail sales events occurring in the month of July, and we see promotions occurring earlier than ever in the season. So consumers have changed their behavior. Retailers have adapted to that. We talked about the shortages that occurred and not having inventory in place. So retailers want to get ahead of that in terms of the supply chain challenges we've experienced the last couple of years. So I think we've already hit peak shipping. I think it is baked in. I think August was probably the peak month for imports for retailers.
Good, thank you. Another question for you, Matt. This one's from Deborah Belgam from Women's Wear Daily. How are retail sales impacted by events like the United Auto Workers strike, Hollywood writers, which are more than 100 days, and the global conflicts that you noted in the Mideast and also Ukraine?
Well, the retail industry is closer to most American households than almost any other industry, and we serve customers every single day. We create jobs for 1 in 4 Americans across the country, and so when there's a labor strike or any kind of external economic issue that affects the economy broadly, that does have an impact on consumer behavior, on consumer psyche, on spending. I don't think we anticipate any dramatic hit to consumer spending as a result of the various labor challenges we're experiencing, whether that's the auto workers earlier this year, the Teamsters, they got their contract ratified. We've seen other labor disputes going on in other segments of the marketplace. But so I don't think there's going to be a dramatic impact or anything we could tie off specifically. But it is true that when there are those external factors out there, years ago it was the fiscal cliff, or if we have a government shutdown, all those things cause people to adjust their behavior. And I will say I was traveling in the Midwest over the weekend, and I saw several of the auto work stoppages. Was by some of those plants, and I saw the picket lines. And those households are going to be impacted. They're not going to spend the same way. That's got an impact on those local economies, other retailers, service businesses, restaurants, dining, other entertainment establishments. So I think it's something to keep an eye on and hope that we get a resolution as quickly as possible, and we'll still have a strong.
Good. A quick question, follow-up from Deborah. We'll go with this question first for Gene and then Matt. Just briefly, do you think it's possible the U.S. will see a recession in the months ahead or more of a soft landing? Gene?
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. No, not in the months ahead. I don't see a recession. Again, by its purest definition in economic terms, it would mean 2 consecutive months of GDP decline. And while we wait for Thursday's early indicator on GDP for quarter number 3, it's expected to outstrip that which we saw in the second quarter. Now, this economy looks so much different than anything we've witnessed. Record number of jobs open, unemployment rate is low, Inflation rate is still up there a little bit higher than most of us would like. And you've got the interest rates continuing to be discussed every single month. The geopolitical sphere, as Matt had just mentioned, is really causing a lot of worry for so many of us. And that will portend what we do in the future from a consumer standpoint. But the fundamentals on the purely economic side look really good, absent anything happening that's a little bit different than we're forecasting right now.
Thanks, Gene. Matt, any follow-up or thoughts on that?
Well, there's certainly enormous uncertainty in the marketplace, but again, as Gene said, this economy is unlike any we've ever seen before. And the one thing that I think continues to puzzle most economists and professional observers of the economy is what's happening on the labor side of the equation, the workforce. There does not appear to be an enormous amount of slack in the labor market. Unemployment rates remain very low, wages are elevated, and as long as there's demand for workers and there's competition and there's wage pressure, that's going to create the opportunity for consumption and for demand, and that puts pressure on inflation. So, that's the double-edged sword here, that we have a very strong, robust labor market with rising wages. Frankly, the last couple of years, more income gains at the lowest quintile of the lowest two quintiles of the labor market. So there have been real gains there, enormous household wealth. By the San Francisco Fed's estimate, more than $3 trillion in excess in savings and checking accounts above what we had before the pandemic. So there's still a lot of firepower on the sidelines. And so that would not seem to be a recipe for a recession or even a substantial slowdown in the economy. But I guess, we're all going to continue to watch this and see how it plays out and, balance that against what the central bank decides to do on interest rates and how high for how long.
Very good. Thank you. We've got a couple questions for Gene here, but I think we're going to skip those for right now. I know Matt's got about 10 more minutes with us, so let's focus on these couple of questions for Matt. Let him go, and then we'll answer Gene's questions. This next one, Matt, is from Bill Mongaluzzo, Journal of Commerce, and also Edwin Lopez from Supply Chain Dive. You touched a little bit on the inventory issue. When will the destocking trend bottom out, and have retailers reduced their inventories enough to free up space for spring merchandise that will enter the country over the next few months?
Well, I think it's a great question. This is certainly something that retailers do talk about and are acutely aware of, striking that balance, particularly during the last couple of years. I think there's been an enormous amount of learning that's taken place, much more sophisticated approaches than even just a couple of years ago. As good as most retailers thought they were at this, I think they've gotten even better of necessity over the last couple of years. We're talking about enormous dollar amounts and, of course, about market share. We saw consumers do dramatic change in customer loyalty relative to various brands and experiences based on what was available during the pandemic, and we saw a lot of opportunities for people to take market share away. So I think at the moment we're in a good place. I think that retailers have, by and large, gotten their inventories in the right place as we head into the next season. Of course, there are always examples of some that haven't quite managed to make that adjustment or haven't executed quite as faithfully as they would like to relative to their aspirations. But I think in general and in the aggregate, the industry's in a better place and will be well positioned for what happens after the holiday season as we get into the spring selling season.
Great. Thank you. This next question is for both Gene and Matt. Matt, I think this is the last one, then we'll be able to let you go. Edwin Lopez following up from Supply Chain Dive. Much has been made of the decline of U.S. imports from China. Is the China Plus One strategy gaining momentum with production shifting to other countries? And how will that impact retailers and global trade in the future? Gene, let's start with you on this.
Yeah, Edwin, I think that this is real and similar to my... Okay, we're here. Thanks, Philip. This is real. And from what we've seen in our discussions with folks who are in the sourcing and procurement areas, as well as our executives that we work with at major importers and exporting companies around the country and the world, similar to my experience living in China during SARS, that folks tried to look at de-risking their supply chain by adding additional sources. I've mentioned in this forum before that in year 2022, 57% of the imports coming through the Port of Los Angeles originated in China. Right now, through the first 3 quarters, it's about 53%. So while there is a bit of a decline, it's not fallen off the cliff, and China will remain a dominant trading partner in our import space for some time to come. Yet we are seeing upticks in volume from Southeast Asian nations, and folks are trying to cobble together great strategies as they move forward when it comes to production capacity, supply chain design, liner shipping companies, terminal operators working in this space as well. So again, we watch these numbers very closely. There is real move in reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, and looking towards Southeast Asia as yet another sourcing capable partner across the board. Thanks, Edwin.
Very good. Matt, some thoughts on China plus one?
Yeah, Edwin, it's a great question, and it's one that I think a lot of us have paid great attention to for the last couple of years. And you know, if you watch the trade space in general, you know that retailers were looking for opportunities to do sourcing from a variety of markets, even before the pandemic, even before the tariffs that were enacted in the previous presidential administration. Retailers were already being impacted by changes in the China economy, in particular relative to increasing labor costs. And you know, the days of China as a extraordinarily or uniquely low-cost labor market had already started to change by the middle of the last decade. And retailers were looking for other places in Southeast Asia and around the world where they could still find the same high-quality goods production, but gain efficiencies relative to the cost of labor. That accelerated with the imposition of the tariffs during the last administration. And then it's continued to accelerate further throughout the pandemic and the geopolitical tensions that have become elevated between the U.S. and China. Having said all that, in my trips over to that market, and unlike Gene, I never have lived there, but I've been going at least once annually every year since the late 1990s. So 25 years of visits and talking to people on the ground and retailers there that are doing sourcing and their sourcing offices. And, you know, while there will continue to be a shift away, I agree completely with Gene's comments that, you know, as one retailer put it to me, China is a garden hose or is a fire hose, and you can't find anything else in that region except garden hoses. You can't replace a fire hose with a garden hose. And there's really nowhere else you can find that capacity. And for certain categories of goods, China remains the dominant producer, and you really are going to have a very difficult time shifting out of that market anytime soon. So there's going to continue to be evolution, but I think it's going to be more gradual. We're not going to see something cataclysmic occur where China is no longer a dominant partner, at least not in the near future.
Thank you, Matt. On that note, I think we'll turn it to Gene to let you go, and then we'll take a few more questions that have come in for Gene. Gene?
Matt, thanks so much for being so gracious with your time. Great to see you, and appreciate all the work that the team and you are doing at the NRF. David French, John Golden, so many that work with us every day. Really thank you for your partnership and support.
Gene, thank you. It's a great partnership and a wonderful friendship, and we're always delighted to be with you. So thank you for the opportunity, Philip. Thank you as well. And thanks, everyone, for letting me join the call today.
Thank you so much. All right, Gene, I have a couple more questions here that we'll finish up with. This is Eric Watkins of Cargomatic. West Coast ports gained about 3.5% in August at the expense of East and Gulf Coast ports. And I think we're seeing that the numbers are stayed about the same, maybe inched upward in September. It looks like the ratified ILW PMA contract has eased the nerves of shippers. How do you see Port of LA volume and market share the remainder of this year and into 2024?
Thanks for joining, Eric. And it's front of mind every day, one of our top areas of focus. And here's the reason why. For every 4 containers we move, we create a job. And to make sure that this Port of Los Angeles is strong, our workforce, private sector companies that we partner with to drive all of this so we can do outsized things in the area of environmental stewardship and workforce training and development, we need this Port of LA to be strong and our neighboring Port of Long Beach. So we're going to continue to chip away going after every pound of freight. But as you rightly said, some industry reports have shown that we saw about a 3.5 to 4 percentage point uptick of cargo coming back to the West Coast. And that basically gets us to where we were over a year and a half ago. And remember, I've shared this insight with the group before as well. Back in 2002, 80% of the Trans-Pacific trade moved over West Coast ports. Before we began talking about this most recent negotiation, we were at 56%. So we're right about where that was prior to those talks. Now, we've got a 6-year contract in front of us. We've got capacity available to us and the ability to have an industry-wide coalition driving for more business to come back to the West Coast. Got to earn it every day, but I'm optimistic that everybody is rowing in the same direction. We still have areas that we have to combat, and I've shared this too. Cost. The more containers we move, the better our unit cost is, but we got to keep that number super elevated as far as volume and throughput. Second, it's a super complex labor landscape, and that's why the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach are embarking on the nation's first goods movement training campus. We want to do our part to help train, upskill, reskill folks across a wide variety of areas in the supply chain so we can continue to have that great workforce of tomorrow. And the last piece is the regulatory environment. And we have given our commitment as the City and Port of Los Angeles to sit down and work with regulators at the federal, state, and local level to make sure that we have a thoughtful approach as to how we get this track toward zero emissions port operations while making sure that we continue to drive this nerve center of the economy and this great employment base of folks that we have here, not only locally and regionally, but nationwide. 1 in 52 jobs nationwide emanates from this port doing its work every day. Thanks for joining as always, Eric.
Last question is from Alicia Robinson of the Long Beach Post. What steps is POLA taking to address the state's vessel emission rules that will soon be enforceable thanks to the US EPA's recent sign-off? Do any cargo terminals still need new infrastructure to meet shore power regulations? And will these rules cause POLA to accelerate any projects or investments?
Well, Vanessa, thanks, and great question. What this basically means is the world-leading strategy and technology that we put in place back in the year 2000 to 2002, cold ironing or alternative marine power for container ships, is now practiced worldwide and is California law. We next embarked on cruise ships, which are so important economically and to our community for that capability of plugging in and shutting off auxiliary engines. Now we need to go to car carriers and liquid bulk vessels. There are a number of things we have to look at technologically, but our resolve has never been stronger. And whether it's bridge technology or that which can emanate from the grid and even hydrogen, now that we are one of 7 hydrogen hubs as designated by the U.S. Department of Energy, I think our future looks very bright. But we need everybody moving in the same direction, public, private interest, as well as investment. Thanks, Vanessa. Appreciate it. We'll keep you posted on this.
Thank you, Gene. That concludes our media questions, and back to you for some final thoughts.
Thanks, Philip. Finally, I want to share 2 major developments on the sustainability front as this continues to be a top priority here at the Port of Los Angeles. First, on October 13th, I joined Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass and others to share the news that California had been named one of the 7 hydrogen hubs in the nation with a $1.2 billion U.S. Department of Energy grant. The ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles are slated to receive a portion of that grant to help jumpstart a robust green hydrogen market right here, as well as advance the use of hydrogen fuel in the goods movement arena. This announcement provides an enormous boost toward our goal of decarbonizing port operations and reducing emissions across the global supply chain. The funds ultimately allocated to the ports will be followed by historic investments of our own and those from the private sector. The goal here is twofold. One, reduce pollution, and two, accelerate zero-emission technology. Over the past 5 years, the Port of Los Angeles has been a hydrogen test lab. We've been partnering with our tenants, longshore labor, original equipment manufacturers, and the state of California to conduct demonstrations of zero emissions, hydrogen fuel cell powered equipment in demanding real-world conditions here at the port complex. With this grant, we'll take our prior work and the valuable lessons learned to evolve into the deployment of technology across the supply chain, focused on the long-term health benefits of our local and regional communities. Second, we're making important strides to establish green shipping corridors between Asia and the San Pedro Bay. In September, officials from the ports of Long Beach and LA traveled to Shanghai to unveil the plan for the first green shipping corridor. Our carrier partners on this project, including CMA CGM, Maersk, the ONE, and Costco Shipping Lines, have set goals to begin deploying reduced or zero life cycle carbon-capable ships in our corridor by the year 2025. In addition to Shanghai, we currently have agreements in place with ports in Tokyo, Nagoya, Yokohama, and Singapore to develop similar green shipping corridors. In fact, just last Friday, we were joined by representatives from the Japan ports, as well as California's Secretary of Transportation, Tokso Mishakin, to discuss our further plans to implement in those trade lanes as well. And later today, I'll join port staff in greeting the mayor of Guangzhou, China, in Guangdong province, and their delegation from the Guangzhou Port Authority to discuss similar efforts with that great port. We'll have another announcement coming out with Guangzhou very soon. All of these international efforts will bring substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions to one of the world's busiest shipping routes. Both of these exciting milestones, the Hydrogen Hub Grant and our advances in the green shipping corridors, are moving us closer toward our ultimate vision, zero emissions at the San Pedro Bay Port Complex. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you again in November. Take care, everyone.